Hi, I'm Max Keiser, and this is the Keiser Report. Propaganda. Yeah, propaganda in British Petroleum, who like to think of themselves as BP. But we know otherwise. Let's get more. Stacy Herbert bringing in the BP story, plus some other stuff about, what's happening over there at PIMCO.
Max, that's my first headline. PIMCO flip-flops. Stops warning about inflation and starts buying treasuries.
That's right. Now, on this show, I told you, the listener and the viewer, that Bill Gross over at PIMCO, who started to play the reflation trade, was dead wrong. The primary trend is deflation. Had he been watching the Keiser Report, he wouldn't have made that nasty U-turn into inflation.
PIMCO has increased its holding of U.S. Treasuries to the highest levels in 5 months, okay? So this represents a total backflip for the company. Previously, they were warning the world about inflation. And in fact, they themselves were positioning themselves for deflation. So the question is this similar to the George Soros move where he got a lot of press attention as one of the most famous hedge fund managers when he was at Davos in January 2010, and he said, gold is in a bubble. And everybody panicked, and gold did sell off a bit. But in fact, he was buying.
So these guys like Bill Gross, who have the bully pulpit of going on big, large financial news networks and making bold statements, are actually using the media to manipulate markets.
Exactly. And Bill Gross does have the ability to move markets as the largest bond trader in the world. If he says that he's preparing for U.S. inflation, then this would have an impact.
Bill Gross, get a real job. Stop manipulating the market. Do something useful.
Well, here's some more bankers terrorizing the markets with their statements. Bankers warn of Basel III hit to GDP. So this is the Institute of International Finance meeting in Vienna. And they're warning that economic growth in the Eurozone, the U.S., and Japan would be cut by 3% between now and 2015 if current proposals to force banks to hold more capital and liquid assets go forward unchanged.
No, you can't have capitalism without capital. You know, the banks, what do they have, 3% on their books as a reserve? They don't even want to keep 3%. You can't have capitalism without capital. What do they want? On their books, chewing gum, Scotch tape, a slice of old pizza? I mean, that's what the Federal Reserve Bank has in Washington. If they do this audit of the Federal Reserve in Washington, Stacy Herbert, what they're going to find is Ben Bernanke's belly button lint. That's the only thing the Federal Reserve has. For in reality, I mean, they might do a switch with some banks like Goldman Sachs and J.P. Morgan to do a toxic waste dump switch for a couple of weeks just to fool the regulators like they do every single quarter. But in reality, they got nothing. And how shame on them for not wanting reserves on their books. How about capitalism for a change?
But they're also warning, this Institute of International Finance, that the world will lose 9.7 million jobs if they have to abide by these regulations.
They're going to lose the jobs anyway because we're caught in a vicious downward deflationary spiral. So it's a false analogy. The jobs loss has nothing to do with it. They're just financial terrorists trying to get a free lunch. Milton Friedman was wrong. There is a free lunch. It's called Wall Street. Now let's turn to the BP story because... I'm sorry, the British Petroleum story. I almost bought into their propaganda. Now, this company is really, they're doing more damage than any extremist group could possibly think of doing. Tell us more.
First, let's give the bankers' perception of this story. Headline reads, Citi, BP is so huge it could survive multiple deep waters. So this is a quote from Citibank. We believe a range of costs around $3 to $8 billion in all net to BP is reasonable.
That means that British Petroleum can do it again. Can do it 5 times. They're not going to have any accountability, and they can do it again because nobody's telling them they can't do it anymore. There's no regulations. They're eco-terrorists, true eco-terrorists.
The real cost that many experts are saying is that the cost of the cleanup and the damage will be between $40 billion and $100 billion. So the fact that Citibank believes that British Petroleum or BP will only pay $3 to $8 billion tells you what they are expecting. The deal they're negotiating with Obama as we speak, as he pretends to be tough with them.
Obama's in the pocket of the oil industry just like Bush was. And when hurricane season comes along, multiply the damage by 5 to 10. And how much money is Buffett going to make on catastrophe bonds? I'm sure he's short the entire region, that turncoat.
Citibank may be right that BP may survive the shareholders, but can they survive the people? Has U.S. bloodlust gone too far? The oil spill could be down to BP's failings, but bankruptcy would destroy livelihoods and pensions on both sides of the Atlantic.
Look, this is perfect bookend stories, because here they say we really care about people's pensions. That's why we want to be able to commit eco-terrorism whenever we feel it's in our interest. And yet, as we just reported 2 minutes ago, they're arguing against Basel III requirements, which would raise capital requirements and raise interest rates, which would directly benefit pension holders. You see, it's the one-armed economist problem. In one instance, they argue against higher interest rates because they really believe that they are serving the interests of the pensions. But on the other hand, they are arguing against higher interest rates because it would somehow cut into their quarterly profits. And it depends on any given day of the week how they're going to lie and misrepresent the truth to the global audience, depending on their own particular self-interest. And that is the very definition of a self-interested radical eco-terrorist.
To put this into context, Felix Salmon says that BP and Shell, between them, account for 50% of the dividends paid by UK companies every year. So these are the two companies. Shell is most responsible for the Niger Delta, turning that area into a no-go zone. Now BP turns the Gulf Coast into a Niger Delta. So what are British pensioners? They're all relying on these situations of disasters around the world.
Yeah, if they really cared about paying people their pension, they would raise interest rates. The Bank of England would raise interest rates if they cared about people's pension. Why recreate the Niger Delta catastrophe in Louisiana?
British pensioners, of course, are facing, in the Niger Delta, they face MEND, the group there, the indigenous groups against the pollution of their own area. In the Gulf Coast of America, they're now facing their own indigenous groups that are also against the British corporation polluting their territory. And that's the Seize BP campaign at seizebp.org. These are groups of Americans protesting around America, and they're demanding that the U.S. government seize the U.S. assets of BP.
Well, they're British. America already had one successful revolution against these clowns. What about American Revolution Part 2?
Well, that takes me to the next headline, Max Keiser. Will the pressure on BP create a real international rift between the U.S. and UK? In the UK, Boris Johnson, the mayor of London, was the most senior UK politician to defend BP. He said the anti-British rhetoric being leveled at the company was a matter of national concern, and that the oil giant was paying a very, very heavy price for what had been an accident. In the U.S., Anthony Weiner, a Democratic senator, declared, whenever you hear someone with a British accent talking about this on behalf of British Petroleum, they are not telling you the truth. The Telegraph also notes, in the past week, Mr. Obama, quote, who insists on referring to BP by its former name, British Petroleum. Mm-hmm. Now, of course, he's trying to link it to it's a British problem, not American, but the other interesting thing is that it became British Petroleum in 1954. Prior to that, it was the Anglo-Persian Oil Company. And according to Jesse's Café Américain, this is the company that inspired Dwight D. Eisenhower to warn Americans about the military-industrial complex, because some argue that it was British Petroleum or Anglo-Persian Oil Company that financed the overthrow of the democratically elected leader of Iran.
Well, let me get this straight. So initially, before it was British Petroleum, it was the what?
The Anglo-Persian Oil Company.
The Anglo-Persian Oil Company. This is the company that Eisenhower warned against when he talked about the threat of the military-industrial complex.
That's correct.
They, in fact, did become the military-industrial complex, along with British Aerospace and other companies in the British conglomeration of corporations, politicians, amalgamating together to create a force of evil and destruction in the world, including America, that's being destroyed by Britain, and some buffoon named, some Tory buffoon in London, Boris Johnson. I challenge him to come on this show. I challenge Boris Johnson. Buffoonery! Because Americans, when they listen to Boris Johnson, they can only think of one thing. Rise up!
But this whole military-industrial complex angle to BP, or British Petroleum, however you wish to call them, takes me to this next headline. BP buys search term oil spill from Google. So BP has bought terms such as oil spill, volunteer, and claims from search engine providers, including Google, in order to help direct Internet users to its website as it attempts to control the worst oil spill in U.S. history, but also to control the flow of digital data.
Military-industrial cyber complex.
And in order to highlight this is also in the news this week, this headline, Iran's Twitter revolution was exaggerated, says editor. The editor is Hamid Tehrani, the Persian editor of the blogging network Global Voices. He calls hyperbolic the Western fantasies of their new media, the fact that the U.S. State Department official who persuaded Twitter to delay a technical upgrade to its software so that it didn't occur during a protest was described as the man who saved Iran, and a former aide to George Bush even suggested awarding Twitter the Nobel Peace Prize for its role in the Iran crisis, which is very similar to BP's role in disseminating information about the oil spill. So Tehrani estimates that there were fewer than 1,000 active Twitter users in Iran at the time of the election. He said, quote, some people did provide updates from Tehran, but many didn't check out. When someone tweeted, for example, that there were 700,000 people demonstrating in front of a mosque, it turned out that only around 7,000 people turned up.
Twitter was hacked by the Pentagon, who used it for propaganda purposes, and the mainstream media bought into it. We reported on our show that this was exactly what was going on, that the Twitter trending topics index was being manipulated, just like stocks on the stock exchange are manipulated by Goldman Sachs to create a price signal that perpetuates political fallout. The trend index on Twitter is manipulated by Twitter after it was hacked, apparently by the Pentagon, to create the perception of something that did not actually happen. All right, Stacy Herbert, thanks so much for being on the Keiser Report.
Thank you, Max.
Don't go away. Much more. Stay tuned.
Every month, we give you the future. We help you understand how we'll get there and what tomorrow will bring. The best in science and technology from across Russia and around the world. Join us for Technology Update on RT.
All right. Welcome back to the Keiser Report. Time to go to Los Angeles, California, to talk to Michael Rupert. Michael Rupert is an investigative journalist and a leading activist in the peak oil movement. He is also the author of Crossing the Rubicon, The Decline of the American Empire at the End of the Age of Oil. His latest book, Confronting Collapse, The Crisis of Energy and Money in a Post-Peak Oil World, which came out in 2009, is the basis for a critically acclaimed documentary, Collapse. The film premiered to rave reviews in 2009 at the Toronto and the Berlin International Film Festivals. The DVD goes on sale today, June 15th. Get your copy of Collapse. All right, Michael Rupert, welcome to the Keiser Report.
Great. It's great to be here. Thank you.
All right. Is the Gulf of Mexico oil spill what peak oil looks like?
The disaster in the Gulf of Mexico is what we expected peak oil to look like as mankind reached a point where it became more expensive, more energy intensive to get energy than it was to sell or burn the energy afterwards.
All right, so just to give folks an idea of peak oil, in other words, half of all the oil that's ever available to be drilled is gone, and that half is the cheap, easy-to-get-to half. Going forward, all the oil that we're going to explore is going to be much more expensive, much harder to find, and what happened in the Gulf is the result of taking bigger risks and going deeper down in the underwater drilling, and is a direct result of peak oil. Now, what about those who say, well, look at what they're finding off Brazil. It's a huge recent discovery, and this disproves peak oil. Your thoughts?
Of course, it absolutely doesn't, and I discuss scenarios like this in my book, Confronting Collapse, and that's because we live in an infinite growth economic paradigm where major corporations that trade their stock publicly, the media corporations, have a vested interest in making everybody believe it's okay and they can go on consuming and burning oil. In a classic example, and Brazil is one, the so-called Carioca discovery made headlines around the world, and people said, oh, there might be 300 billion barrels of oil down here. Well, the world's using 1 billion barrels about every 12 days. But what you see after that, after a one well drill, is that no appraisal wells were drilled, and then 2 or 3 weeks later, and I documented this in the book, you see these small correction stories that appear on the back pages of the newspapers that say, this field wasn't that big, but what was planted in the consumer's mind with intent was that, oh, we have all this abundant cheap oil, and it's not really there at all.
Now, as the title of your book and film suggests, because of peak oil, we will see collapse. Tell us a little bit more about this, how and when.
The collapse that I refer to is the collapse of human industrial civilization. There are 5 billion people on the planet today who did not exist until mankind started using oil. The world's population was stable at about 1.5 billion people until we started using oil roughly at the turn of the last century. There's 10 calories of hydrocarbon energy in every calorie of food consumed in the industrialized world. If you take away that energy, the oil and natural gas, oil, of course, is all plastics, pesticides, it's in your toothpaste, cosmetics, everything else, then you cannot support that population level. Now, where my work has been unique, my first book is in the Harvard Business School library, is that I combine a very detailed analysis of a hopelessly corrupt economic paradigm. It's not just that the books are cooked in a couple of companies, they're cooked everywhere. We're seeing that in Europe. But I combine the economic corruption and the infinite growth paradigm with the lack of energy, and that's where we run into real problems. In the documentary Collapse, which is doing very well, what I say clearly is that printed money represents the ability to do work. Oil is the ability to do work, and the symbol, the paper money, is worthless without the energy to back it up. That's the conundrum. Now, when I say collapse, it's of human industrial civilization. It's not something that happens overnight. The Roman Empire didn't collapse overnight, nor did any of the other major empires that have collapsed throughout human history. A fast crash for human industrial civilization is 20 years, meaning that that's 20 consecutive years where each year is worse than the one that preceded it until you get to a bottom or some kind of stasis. And I said in the movie clearly, and it's all coming true as we speak, that the summer of 2010 would be the cliff event.
A cliff event in 2010? Talk a little bit more. What is this cliff event?
I'm not the only peak oil activist. There are many scientists, PhDs from all disciplines who have been studying this for many years, going back to about 1950. And what everyone has foreseen was an event called the bumpy plateau, which would happen when oil prices rose to a certain point and spiked, which we saw in the summer of 2008 with $147 a barrel oil. And then you would stumble along a bumpy plateau where oil price rises would shut down economic activity, and then prices would drop, and you'd have a little increase in economic activity, and you would follow this until the point in time when you left the bumpy plateau and started an irreversible downslope. Our bumpy plateau roughly lasted from 2005 until now, but all of the research that I did and many others have done, but the economic research I've done says that summer of 2010 was when everything came together. In other words, after billions or hundreds of billions, actually trillions, 11 trillion in the U.S. alone in bailouts, there are no more bailout dollars capable of being printed by any government. We're seeing the debt service issues now tear Europe apart. They will be here within a matter of months. So you can't print money to get us out of this, and we will see, as a result of shortages and decline, serious price spikes this summer. I think $100 oil is a certainty before we get to September, and that will shut down the economy in short order. And then we start the irreversible downslope that we don't know how long it's going to take or what it's going to look like when we get there, and that's what my new venture, CollapseNet, is all about.
And you also make an interesting point in that the U.S. dollar in all fiat currencies, ever since going off the gold standard in 1971, of course, the U.S. adopted what is effectively the petrodollar, so that what you're saying is the oil collapse is taking away the only real collateral to the U.S. dollar. And so it's a twin collapse of both energy collapse, but also fiat currency U.S. dollar collapse. Is that correct?
All fiat currencies are doomed. There's no question about it in my mind. With the European collapse, which is well underway, and I think the euro zone is doomed, and I think the euro is doomed. That's pretty clear. we're seeing a little boost to the dollar as people flee, but it's like changing decks on the Titanic as it's sinking. All fiat currencies are doomed because really what's happening is a $700 trillion derivatives bubble is imploding, and there is no way to service that debt. The only way for people to really survive is to disengage as much as possible from the monetary paradigm.
Okay, and just to put a little additional point on what I'm trying to say there. In other words, the fiat currency, the fractional reserve, the global pyramid scheme that is monetarization of the money supply is backed up by essentially oil. So even if you could make the case that these fiat currencies might have some intrinsic value at some point tied to oil, the fact is that oil is now peaked. So really that's the final nail in the coffin. What about technology? People say, you know what, we're going to come up with new technology. Yes. We're going to replace the oil standard paradigm. What about this, Mike Rupert?
In my book, Confronting Collapse, and to a smaller extent in the movie, I laid out very clearly there is no combination of any alternative energy sources that will replace the edifice built by fossil fuels. You've got 800 million internal combustion powered vehicles on the planet with 7 gallons of oil in every tire, and taking maybe 15, 20,000 gallons of oil each to make in terms of the energy input. And we don't have any other technology to plug in, and those vehicles will only run on, and that includes airplanes and ships, on oil. And we waited way too long, and there's a number of studies that have confirmed that, some from the U.S. government. There is nothing to change to. We waited way too long.
Okay, the EIA, the statistics arm of the Department of Energy, recently released its International Energy Outlook for 2010. They still see production rising from 86 million barrels per day to 92 million barrels per day by 2020. Your thoughts?
Well, and the Minerals Management Service of the U.S. government also told us that all the rigs operating in the Gulf were safe. I mean, people really need to get over this idea that government tells the truth. Both the EIA, which is a part of the U.S. government, and the IEA, which is a UN organization, are offering conflicting reports. But the International Energy Agency has basically come out within the last 6 months, basically since the movie's been out, and said, no, we're running out. We're changing all of our numbers. All these rosy predictions we put out for all that time were not correct.
All right, now, I think the biggest takeaway here is that this Gulf oil disaster is clear evidence of peak oil. It's a bit counterintuitive because a lot of pundits will say, look, there's so much oil out there, it's spilling everywhere. How can that be peak oil? But given in the context of the global actual demand for oil, this is not should not be construed in any way as being evidence of there being lots of oil. This Gulf oil disaster is tied to peak oil in that people are going after riskier finds, which are more costly, and of course the cost for this disaster and the cleanup, it has to be, even though BP is not going to pay for it apparently, somebody's going to pay for it, and that's the cost of peak oil. Is that a fair characterization?
Basically, yes, that's very good. I mean, if there was an abundance of oil, we would still be pumping oil out of the ground in Texas with a net energy cost far less. How much energy do you put in versus the energy you get out? Saudi Arabia is now drilling offshore. Some of the biggest fields in the world are in decline. Production is proof. Cantarell in Mexico, the North Sea is in decline, Bergen in Kuwait. All these supergiant fields are falling off a cliff in terms of production. Okay,
I noticed you didn't mention Gawar in Saudi Arabia because I guess they don't publish figures.
Well, I think it's very clear that Saudi Arabia has passed its peak of production, and that's the last thing the Saudi government can afford to let a restive population know. I am in complete agreement with Matthew Simmons, the world's largest energy investment banker, whose book Twilight in the Desert clearly documented Saudi decline, and the fact is they lie. Why should we be surprised if oil companies and nation states lie when we've seen Lehman Brothers, Bear Stearns, we've seen Citigroup, AIG, we've seen all of this huge lying and the current lying by BP about what they're doing. These people don't tell the truth. You have to measure it by what the observable facts are and stop listening to what the lips are saying.
Right. So Cantarell in Mexico, Bergen in Kuwait, they're down, I believe, something, these giant super fields, 20% year over year. Is that correct?
I don't recall the exact statistics, but Let's take Cantarell in Mexico, which was the biggest field that Pemex, the Mexican State Petroleum Company, had. Its production is down something like 30% over the last 5 years, but that trend is continuing to go down. And that's an underlying cause for the massive social unrest in Mexico, because most of Mexico's GDP was a result of Mexican oil exports, which are falling off a cliff. Hence, you have massive unemployment, you have increasing poverty, a Mexican government that's basically crippled right now with no income. This is where the cartels are stepping in to fill the void. But this dislocation is a clear example of what collapse looks like in Mexico. It's happening now all over the world, either economically or as a result of energy. So, this is what it looks like.
Yeah, it's funny because the politicians in Arizona want to build bigger and bigger walls to keep out immigrants. But from what you're saying, what others are saying, it's all tied back to peak oil, which is really the 800-pound gorilla that nobody wants to talk about. Okay, Mike Rupert, thanks so much for being on the Keiser Report.
It was my pleasure. Thank you very much.
All righty, now Michael's film, Collapse, is out today, June 15th, in DVD form. So, get it, because it's fantastic. It ties a lot of the loose ends together and will help you understand why the crisis in the banking sector is tied to the oil sector. And that's going to do it for this edition of the Keiser Report. I want to thank my guests, Stacy Herbert and Mike Rupert. And if you want to send me an email, please do so at keiserreport@rttv.ru. Until next time, this is Max Keiser saying bye, y'all.